I'm sure a lot of you guys remember the old ceremonial hunting tradition of eating the heart out of the first animal you kill. Meat from those organs are among the most nutrient-rich foods on the planet. You can get those same benefits your ancestors craved via convenient daily capsules from Heart and Soil. Find out more at heartandsoil.co. And remember, use code MeatEater for 10% off your purchase.
Outdoor adventure won't wait for engine problems. Things like hard starts, rough performance, and lost fuel economy are often caused by fuel gum and varnish buildup. Seafoam can help your engine run better and last longer. You simply pour a can into your gas tank. Hunters and anglers rely on Seafoam to keep their engines running the way it should the entire season. So pick up a can of Seafoam today at your local auto parts store or visit seafoamworks.com to learn more.
Welcome to the Wired to Hunt podcast, your home for deer hunting news, stories, and strategies. And now, your host, Mark Kenyon.
Welcome to the Wired to Hunt podcast. I'm your host, Mark Kenyon, and this is episode number 95. Today in the show, we're joined by Lindsay Thomas Jr. to discuss the lessons he's learned deer hunting the South. All right, welcome to the Wired to Hunt podcast, brought to you by Sitka Gear. And today we are addressing a request that we've heard loud and clear from many of our listeners. And my apologies this has taken so long, but finally we are going to be talking in depth about the unique circumstances and challenges that are present when deer hunting in the South. Now, Dan and I are Midwest guys, as you know, so Southern deer hunting isn't something we've been able to really comment on, given the fact that I don't think either of us really have any experience with it, but I know there are lots of you out there who have been wanting some Southern insight, and today I'm happy to report we're finally going to give that to you. Joining us, hailing from the great state of Georgia, is Lindsay Thomas Jr. Now, Lindsay is a terrific deer hunter. He's the Quality Deer Management Association's Director of Communications and the editor of Quality Whitetails magazine. So in just a few minutes, we're going to give Lindsay a call to dig deep into all things Southern deer hunting. And I want to say one other thing. For all of you folks who live elsewhere, who aren't in the South, don't tune this one out. I promise you, there's going to be plenty that Lindsay is going to say today that's going to be relevant and helpful to you as well. So with all that said, before we do get Lindsay on the line, I have an important announcement, Dan.
Is it big?
It's real big. It's
okay.
I was about to make a Donald Trump joke, but I'm not going to.
It's going to be huge.
Yeah. This, you and me have talked about this a lot, right? In the beginning of most of our episodes, at least for the past year or so, we usually have like an intro period where you and me talk and BS for a while, right?
Right.
And I've mentioned to you in the past that we occasionally get complaints about that. Every once in a while I get a tweet or a Facebook message or something that says, stop talking about the stupid stuff at the beginning and just get to the point. So that bummed me out when I first heard that. But since since I verbalized that, to you, I don't know, so many months ago, I've gotten lots and lots of other comments and emails from people saying, no, we love it. We love the BS. Keep it going. But it's always been something I've always wondered about, is it too much? Do we talk for too much at the beginning? Do people not want to hear from you and me because we're idiots and they just want to get to the guest? I've been kind of sensitive to it, trying to figure out, what's the right balance. So this past two weeks ago, I think, I sent out a survey to our audience through our email subscriber list and social media and the blog and everything. There's a whole bunch of different questions in that, and some of it was related to feedback on this podcast. So we had lots of people write in with comments and all sorts of stuff. So first off, thank you to everyone that took that survey. But specifically in that suggestion section, a lot of people commented on our introductory BS session, Dan. A lot of people had opinions on it. So I am going to announce today what the overall consensus was on our BS session. Do more people like it or not like it? What's your guess, Dan? What do you think? Are we winning with the BS session or not?
I think people like it because it makes them feel smarter.
Just they hear how dumb we sound, and
Exactly.
that makes
God,
them feel
those
good.
guys are idiots. Hey, I feel pretty good about myself.
That might be what it is. I never thought of that, but it makes a lot of sense. Oh, that's funny. Well, regardless of what I don't know what the reason is. It could be that, or it could be some other reason. But I'm here to report the results. 81% of those who commented about our BS session loves them. 81%. So I apologize, but we are going to keep doing them.
Those other people, they can skip to the good stuff if they want to, I guess. I don't know.
Yeah. I think, I don't guess, who knows? You and me, our opinion obviously is biased since it's our junk that we're talking about. But 81% like it, so we're going to stick with it. We're going to share our little stories and the dumb little insights. Although someone did complain about you always complaining about your kids, Dan.
Hey, good. That's what I was just going to say. I was like, well, Mark talks about what he did out in the whitetail woods, and Dan bitches about his kids.
I got a real big chuckle out of that. So,
was there a lot of them, or was there just like one guy going, "Hey, man, Dan complains about his kid"?
No, I think there's just one person who mentioned the kids specifically. Otherwise, it was in general they like what we're doing, and you too, Dan. So
okay, full disclosure, I love my family. Okay, I love them.
I know you do. They know you do.
Good,
but hey, I can understand the challenges you got. You need to vent once in a while. That's important.
Right, and I got to do it to somebody because I can't complain to my wife.
No, this is your safe place, Dan. I want to keep this your safe place.
Okay,
you can share those things, all right?
Thank you.
So with that said, then I guess we do have a couple minutes before we need to call Lindsay. So we are going to BS, and I want to hear about your shed rally. Right, this past weekend was shed rally. We both went shed hunting. Talk to me about it.
I really don't know if I would call it a rally of any sort. I went for an 8-hour walk. It was nice, I guess. Took my wife, and this was her first real experience of what I would call not really an all-day shed hunt, but we were out for 8 hours. And when I say out for 8 hours, there was like an hour, maybe a little over an hour lunch break that we went into a small town and got a Iowa pork tenderloin, which we're famous for. And yeah, we found one shed.
It was a bingo bango too, wasn't it?
It was right the very first, me and my wife walked in the middle of this cornfield, and we, just kind of, hey, let's give this little spot a shot. And this buffer strip, this really small fork horn antler is just laying right there where I was standing, and sure enough, that was it. And then we walked for 7 more hours.
Brutal.
And she was like, I don't know if I'm going to go shed hunting with you again.
She didn't get it.
Because I had to ease her into it, right? So it's her first time, so I'm not going to be, sending her through the thick stuff right away.
Right.
So we went into some open timber along some bedding areas, and we went into a couple open CRP fields. And then just to test it out, I was like, hey, babe, you're going to want to wear a hat, and you might not want to wear this particular jacket. Oh, I'll be fine. I'm like, okay, I'm not going to argue with you. So I sent her through some multiflower rows, some trails that went through some thorns. And I was kind of up on top of this ridge going through some really thick stuff and looking down on her, and it was like these thorns were getting caught in her hair, and I was laughing on the inside, but I had to act concerned on the outside.
Of course.
So I had to barrel down there and help her. Okay, back out, walk around this way, and then
oh, I'm so sorry, honey. I'm so sorry.
Yeah. Oh, this was a dumb idea on my part. I should have never sent you down there. And then we ended up going to a different piece, which was easier walking. So although I didn't get to cover as much property as I liked, I still got to go shed hunting. And according to my buddy who's still running trail cameras, he's like, there's still quite a few deer holding.
Yeah. That's what I've been hearing from a lot of people. A lot of people are saying that. I had a similarly rough shed rally as you did, Dan. As we've talked about via text, it was, man, a lot of people I've been hearing from, not just me and you, but from a lot of people I've heard that it's been pretty slow going lately. me and my buddy Corey and Josh, we went shed hunting all day Friday, all day Saturday. And I actually went down early Thursday. We knocked on a bunch of doors in the pouring rain, trying to get permission on some new farms. We knocked on like a dozen doors and got permission on just one. So it was very disappointing from that standpoint. Also, in other news, while that night, so I'm knocking on doors, we're getting permission. I only got the one spot, so I'm feeling kind of down. We're a little bit worried now because we weren't going to have as many farms to walk as we thought. Well, at the last minute, I was like, you know what? We need a little pick-me-up. I'm going to run down to my lease. Let's drive by there. I'll run into the woods, grab these trail cameras that I've had running since November, and then come back and we'll get to check those tonight when Josh gets into town. So I was all excited to check these pictures that have been, stoking for 5 months out there. So I run out there to get the cameras, and I grab the first one. It's still on. The batteries are still going. It's taking pictures. So I was like, holy smokes, that's awesome. I go to the second one. The camera's not on. I go to the third one. The camera's not on. And I'm really confused. I'm like, my buddy Josh set the cameras up before he left last. And I'm like, Josh, how did you do this? You didn't turn the cameras on? But when I opened the cameras and looked closer, the cameras had been turned off and the SD cards had been stolen.
Oh, those sons of bitches! God,
I was so mad. I don't
even want to talk about it.
I was just really, really upset because
someone got busted on those trail cameras, and that's where all your sheds are at in somebody's truck.
That's exactly what we've been thinking. Is that we got shed poached, and they walked by the cameras, saw that, and I was like, oh, we got pictures taken of us. They snagged our SD cards, and so there's someone right now. Maybe you're listening. If you are listening, and there are some people in that area who know of me. And so if you happen to be listening and you happen to have taken those pictures, man, just email me the good pictures at least. Let me see what's on there. In all seriousness, no, it's really disappointing. I don't know why people would do that, why they got to be trespassing, trying to poach antlers, trying to do things like that. I just don't get it. It's a shame. And the rest of the weekend didn't go much better. We walked 17 miles over the course of those 2 days between three of us, and we found 2 fresh antlers. That was it. So it was just a tough weekend. I think I wrote an article actually today on Wired to Hunt about this. Couple questions, what's going on, because there's so many people that said that this was such a tough weekend and a tough shed hunting season in general. And I had 3 theories. I don't know if these hold up at all, but one, it was such a mild winter that there's some deer that are still holding, right? There's deer holding longer than maybe they typically do, like you mentioned, and a lot of people I've talked to have said. Number 2, maybe because of how mild the winter is, the deer have not had to congregate in small areas like they typically do to take advantage of limited food or cover.
Yep.
And so, now the sheds are spread out over a wide distance versus some years like that really hard winter we had in 2013, I think, where you'd find tons of sheds in a couple different sections. So that wasn't the case this year. And then finally, shed hunting just seems to be getting so much more popular that there's more and more people out there, more people shed hunting on the same properties or trespassing and poaching your property like happened to me. And in addition to our lease, which got poached, we think, of the other 4 farms we walked, 3 out of those 4 had already been walked. There was boot prints all over the place. So it was like, when you live out of state and you come in for one weekend, it's a pretty tough situation because, if you get there too early, the sheds are on the ground. If you get there too late, everyone's already walked it already. Right. So, it was fun to be out there. Had a great time with my buddies, but it was frustrating from that standpoint too.
Now, I tell you what, my stepbrother lives south of me, and he's finding a ton of dead mature bucks.
Dead bucks?
Dead bucks. So he's found like 4 or 5 dead deer ranging anywhere from 150 to 170.
Yikes.
Yep. Now, I haven't found any dead deer, and the guy who hunts the property north to me, and he's got food plots, and he went out and he said he hasn't found any dead deer yet, or he hasn't, and he's only found like a couple sheds, and he's got food plots, and nobody touches his property because he makes sure of it. Now, and he's got trail cameras out, and he's kind of a property Nazi, like anyone should be if they own property and are serious about whitetail hunting. And he tells me, I call him up, and we've never spoken before, and I just was kind of curious. I wanted to know what he was seeing. And he said he had kind of had the same thing going on as me. He's like, as soon as right around the velvet strip where all the deer started shedding their velvet, all of his mature bucks disappeared. and he does not know where they went. And this year, he said he was chasing one 4.5-year-old, and everything else was a younger age class. So,
this is your southern farm, southern area?
Yep, this is my southern farm, and other people that I've talked to said that the quality of deer in our area has gone down, and the mature bucks have seen, although there were a couple. When the season hit, they all disappeared. They weren't showing up on trail camera. They weren't showing up, in food plots. I guess from what he was telling me, just big deer weren't getting killed in our area.
Now, this isn't the neighbor that we sometimes talk about that's got the great, really, really, really great property with the tons and tons of food, right? I kind of wonder if that's maybe where, once the season hits, you get tons of deer flocking to that section, do you think?
Well, possibly. But during the rut, they have so many deer on their property, the loser leaves. I mean, I've just seen a change in movement over the past couple of years. And this guy to the north of me kind of confirmed it. And
interesting. Very interesting.
I don't know. Well, I needed to run. It sucks because I want to leave trail cameras out all year round, but I'm afraid to because I think people are going to steal them. So it's like, how the hell am I supposed to do what I want to do? I'd just be wasting money.
It's tough. It's a bummer these days. Now that I've had these issues on this lease, I'm probably going to start locking those cameras up. I've done that on other properties, but it hadn't been an issue to this point here, but I'm probably going to have to start doing that soon. So,
well, here's the deal. You lock it up. They don't just steal the SD card. They break your camera either to get to the SD card or they take the whole damn thing.
Right. Hopefully you can avoid at least the lazy ones, but some guys like that will not take no for an answer, I suppose, right?
Right.
Not ideal. Not ideal at all. But we're going to have to put a timeout on this convo because we do need to bring Lindsay on the line, who I think will uplift us. He's going to give us some positive deer hunting stuff to talk about.
We're going south on the Wired to Hunt podcast.
Yes, we're going south. So let's take a quick minute here to thank our partners at Sitka Gear, and then we'll give Lindsay a call. All right, so as we do on each episode, we're talking to Sitka product category leader Dennis Zuck. And today, I want to ask Dennis a little bit about a question that we sometimes hear about Sitka, and that being, how can Sitka manage to produce clothing for such different groups as western big game hunters, whitetail hunters, and waterfowl hunters, and still be able to produce awesome stuff for each of those different groups of people? Here's Dennis.
Yeah, and we don't, outwardly those categories are absolutely exist and it's real, and we make different products for all of them. But, before we see ourselves as, a big game brand or whitetail brand or waterfowl brand, we see ourselves as an apparel company. We see ourselves as people who spend a lot of time thinking about materials and thinking about cuts and thinking about how to address hunters' needs. And in the walls of Sitka, we have people in each of those categories who are absolute fanatical hunters in their own right. Then we have a host of people who, whether they're an ambassador, a pro staff, or an athlete, who absolutely carry that torch as well. So the combination of us understanding apparel and understanding apparel development and understanding the hunt and the hunter, that makes us absolutely qualified to make products for all those categories. And that with an engineering or a scientific kind of mindset around making sure you do things you can prove and making sure there's real legitimacy behind the claims you want to make, I think is absolutely a recipe for success, or at least I hope it is.
All right. Awesome insight. So if you'd like to learn more about Sitka Gear's clothing, whether it be for whitetails, other big game, or waterfowl, you can visit sitkagear.com. And now let's get back to the show and give Lindsay a call. All right. With us now on the line is Lindsay Thomas Jr. Welcome to the show, Lindsay.
Thanks, Mark. I am honored to be here and really pleased to join you guys.
Thank you for that. We're really excited to chat with you as well. I've really enjoyed over the recent years getting to know you, and it's going to be a blast getting to chat today about a topic which I'm also personally excited to talk about because it's something we really haven't dived into at all on the show yet, which I'm sorry about. I wish we had, but we're going to be talking about deer hunting in the South. And I know that's something that you are very familiar with given where you live and where you hunt. But I guess before we get into all that, I'm getting ahead of myself. I briefly introduced you to our audience just a couple minutes ago at a very high level. But for those who aren't familiar with who you are and what you do, can you give us a little bit of background as to what you are doing today in the whitetail world?
Yeah, I am Director of Communications for the Quality Deer Management Association, QDMA. And one of my main roles, I do a lot of things in that role, but one of the big ones is I'm editor of our magazine, Quality Whitetails. That's QDMA's membership journal. I've been doing that now for almost 13 years with QDMA. And before that, for about 9 years, I was an editor with a Georgia hunting and fishing publication called Georgia Outdoor News. So I've been in outdoor journalism for, more than 20 years now. I'm just sitting here calculating it up. But
Wow.
And I'm originally from Georgia, grew up in southeast Georgia near the coast, grew up hunting there, and fortunate enough to not have to leave my home state in my career, and now work with QDMA in Athens, Georgia, which is northeast Georgia, roughly about an hour east of Atlanta. And so I'm really only about 4 hours from where I grew up, from my family's hunting land and the ground I'm familiar with. So, yeah, I'm, from the South, born and raised here, hunt here, still live here, but very fortunate and pleased to be able to do what I do for QDMA because, as an outdoor communicator and a person who has a passion for deer hunting and deer management, I'm right where I want to be.
Yeah, well, I can say quite honestly that I think that the work you're doing is some of the very, very best in the outdoor journalism world. I absolutely love Quality Whitetails. From a long time ago, before I was even writing or doing anything, I was just a member of QDMA, and seeing the magazine you guys put out, it's just always a fun read and a very educational read, and just really nicely put together. So I guess just mad props to you for such a great job you guys are doing over there. I really enjoy it.
I appreciate that, and I would say, well, it comes from great contributors. And Mark, you have been a contributor, as you know, over the last couple of years, and we're pleased to have you as one of them. And as members learned here in our new issue, a couple of your articles from last year were voted very highly among our readers at the end of the year survey in terms of some of their favorite articles of the year. So
that's awesome.
Again, we have high quality contributors like yourself. So that kind of bounces back on you.
Well, thank you. I appreciate that. That's awesome to hear that people enjoy those pieces, and I'm looking forward to putting together some new ones for you guys this year. Hopefully all the strange, dumb things I do in the woods turn out into good stories that I can share with people.
Well, that's a lot of the appeal is following along, and a lot of people are in your shoes of where you are in your hunting career, but also your communications and journalism career of really pulling yourself up by your own bootstraps and learning as you go, and not being afraid to tell your followers not only your successes but your failures and what you've learned, and kind of the downs and the ups of being a deer hunter and being Mark Kenyon. And that's what I really think is kind of the key to some of your appeal.
I appreciate that. It's funny, on this topic, I was talking to your colleague and my friend Matt Ross, who also works with the QDMA, and we were talking about what I've been doing and kind of the stories I've shared and everything. And Matt kind of said something similar. He told me that I have the market cornered on failure. So I guess that's my thing.
I wouldn't go that far, but then Matt's from New York, and there we have a good illustration of Southern hospitality and politeness versus Northern honesty.
Exactly. So I got a kick out of that one. So that's awesome. So Lindsay, speaking of the North versus this, well, I don't want to say the North versus the South, but speaking about the differences between hunting in the South and hunting other places, that's really one of the main things I wanted to talk about today, given the fact that, me and Dan, we don't have any experience hunting in the southern part of the country, but a lot of our listeners do and are interested in learning more about it. And I think even those that hunt in the northern parts of the country and the Midwest, I think we can all learn something that we can apply to our own deer hunting just by better understanding what's going on in other parts of the country too. So really at a high level, that was my goal today, is to kind of pick your brain about what's different, what do people need to do differently down there to have success, and a lot of things like that. And it sounds like you were raised in Georgia, you hunt in Georgia, maybe you've hunted other places across the South. From your experience, do you believe that deer hunting in the South really is that different from other places across the country?
There are a lot of small differences, I think I would say. It really, at the end of the day, is not that different. you and I and Dan, we're all deer hunters, and your listeners, we're all deer hunters, and at the core, there is a lot more that connects us than separates us. But there are, when I think about it, and there are a lot of little ways that it's different, but not so big that we don't still all understand each other, if that makes sense. So yeah, there's a good many small ways that it's different. And I have not, I've hunted mostly in Georgia. I've hunted a little bit outside of Georgia. I have, honestly, though I've traveled there and seen deer properties there, I've never hunted in the Northeast or the Midwest. So I really haven't hunted outside the South. I guess, and I've written about this before, how I kind of share this characteristic with a lot of QDMA members and people who practice QDM, in that, and you can probably, you guys can probably agree to this too, that I have a passion for where I hunt and where I manage deer and where I kind of know the dirt. And I get invitations from friends who live in the Midwest, to come hunting with them. And man, I would love to do that given the time and money, and if more of those resources were more abundant. But at the end of the day, I have to be honest and say that I still would rather go hang and hunt a stand in a place I know, based on information I know about the deer I've come to learn, and hunt those deer, than to be, go hunt with a friend and be put in a stand that they know. And even if it means seeing a bigger, better deer. So don't get me wrong. I still hope to take up those invitations one day when I have more time again and money to travel and that freedom. But really, I'm passionate about what I do and the deer I know. And there's a lot of folks, deer hunters and QDMA members, that will tell you that yeah, we understand that I can't grow the same deer body size and antler wise than you can in other parts of the country, but I still would rather, hunt the deer I know. That's what this passion is about. So no, I haven't gotten out of the South, but in terms of hunting. But being an editor for Quality Whitetails and communications director for QDMA, when I came here 13 years ago, all of a sudden I had a national audience where I had not had that before. And I have learned over the years many of these little ways that separate us, terminology and differences in approach, differences in habitat, that do make a difference when it comes to perspective and communicating one deer hunter to another about what you do versus what I do, and making assumptions you can't make about, understanding what you understand about how deer hunting works and what our perspectives are. So yeah, it's been something over the years that I've learned. Again, all these sort of small ways that separate us.
I first want to say that I think Dan and I both definitely 100% agree with you about that special connection you can have with a place and how much fun and how fulfilling it is to hunt, in a location or deer population where you can get to know the area, get to know maybe the deer and patterns and figure all those things out and do it yourself. For me, at least, I love being able to do it myself. I just don't have the same enjoyment or fulfillment if I was just showing up at a random place and being put somewhere. So I totally get what you're saying with that, for sure. Another thing you mentioned, though, was kind of your connection with that region and deer hunting in the South. And it got me thinking about culture and history. I assume there's some interesting things about deer hunting culture in the South that me up here in Michigan and Dan in Iowa, we just don't know about or understand. Is there anything that you can think of, off the top of your head about the history or culture of deer hunting in the South that's different, that's, something important to you down there and to other hunters in the area that is worth mentioning? Yeah,
and a lot of these things kind of tie back to some of the big picture differences between these regions of the country. To cite an example, one of the first things I learned when I came to work for QDMA and began organizing and planning and publishing Quality Whitetails was some of the terminology I had to be careful about, like hunting lease or hunting club. In the South, I grew up talking about going to the hunting club, or the concept of having a lease, a deer hunting lease. And what I learned right off the bat was those terms are not well known in the North and the Midwest. And that, I think that's changed some over time. In fact, there's even some, you'll hear complaints that the concept of leasing hunting rights has expanded from the South into the North, and a lot of people in the North aren't happy about that change. But historically, growing up in the South, the idea of a hunting club and a hunting lease was sort of ubiquitous. It was, just understood that was a predominant way a lot of people had the rights to hunt land, was they leased those rights. And often they would form what we just sort of referred to as hunting clubs. And I think in the North, maybe that evoked kind of the idea of a country club, where sort of the elite go to play golf, or in this case, go to hunt. But that's not at all what it is. It's just kind of became the term for where average deer hunters like us, that was where you went on the weekend to your lease and joined the guys in the club, and you camped and whatever, and you did your hunting. And those terms, when I stop and think about them, not only the term hunting club and lease, but the idea of leasing property rights goes pretty far back in the South. And ultimately what that comes from, I believe, is the predominant land ownership pattern historically of large timber companies owning most of the land. And I think timber companies were some of the first to realize, hey, if we're owning this land to produce timber income, what other types of income can we get out of this? And the hunting lease, the lease of hunting rights, became one of those things. We will charge folks extra for the right to come in during deer season and hunt deer on our timberlands, and that's an additional source of income. And that goes way back. And I think those concepts are more foreign in the North and the Midwest because that historical pattern of large timber companies, a small number of very big for-profit timber companies owning the majority of the land, is not there. You don't see that pattern. And like we have in the South and still have today. Now it's changing, but historically over the long term, timber companies were, if you didn't own a farm or whatever, or own land, most deer hunters were going to a timber company lease. They were leasing those rights. And in fact, many of, when I remember being a very young boy, even before I was tagging along my dad was hunting leased timber company land, or he was hunting, with his friends, local WMAs that were timber company land leased by the state for public hunting opportunities. And many of those WMAs go way back. They're still around, and many of them are still timber company land that the state leases on behalf of hunters to hunt that public land. And I think even some of the very first WMAs in Georgia and in the South were that concept. It was timber company land, the state leased. But you also had, probably had more, and certainly today have more, situations where a group of hunters get together, lease a chunk of timber company land, and that's their, quote, hunting club. And, rather than call it the lease or whatever, hunting club kind of became the predominant name for it. And it's, Friday before opening day of gun season here in Georgia, you can watch the hunting club parade. All the trucks pulling trailers loaded down with four-wheelers and coolers and food plot seed, heading out of Atlanta, out of urban areas, out of the towns, into the countryside to the hunting club and the hunting lease. And a lot of, big picture, that format there of timber company land explains some of that culture that you don't find in the North, where in general, as I've come to find, property sizes are on average much smaller. You have a lot more private landowners with much smaller tracts than you do in the South, where you have fewer private landowners and bigger tracts. Now that's changing. The timber company model, of course, is now breaking up even in the South for a number of reasons. But it really ultimately can be tied back and help explain a lot of things we'll talk about, right now, including habitat. The average habitat that a Georgia or southern deer hunter looks at when he or she hits the woods is different than what you see in the North and the Midwest, and a lot of that's explained by that historical pattern of timber company ownership.
Yeah, that definitely is. It makes sense when I think about some of these things. The few things I do know about hunting in the South, with that context of the land ownership and how that works, I can see how some of those things kind of happened to the point of deer hunting clubs. That's something, right? I'm not really exposed to that, having experience with that, but I've heard about it a lot. Can you tell us a little bit more about? I know you mentioned a group of guys and they'll have that, they'll share hunting access to a property, but can you elaborate a little bit about, how specifically a deer hunting club works? Because I've always kind of wondered about this. I've heard that sometimes the clubs have like a board where you show up on a Friday and you have to, you get rights to a certain stand or different things like that. I mean, how do these large groups of people, 20, 30 people, or however large they might be, I guess you could better tell me that, but how does a large group of people like that share a property, share responsibilities on the property, all those things? I don't know what I'm talking about. So tell me, Lindsay, how does a deer hunting club work?
It varies. You'll see a lot of different groups trying different things, and ultimately that's kind of one of the dynamics that's interesting about a lot of clubs and how they manage that and how everybody gets along. And but you see different things. But basically, like I said, it's a group of guys, whether it is, me and some of the people I work with, or neighbors, or a church group, or just, sometimes even people just put out want ads and meet each other on the line or whatever. That way, I got a lease in so-and-so county looking for members. And, someone somewhere gets access to the lease, whether it's from, leasing the rights from a farmer, from somebody who owns private land, or timber company or whatever, and let's say they got the lease. So now we put the club together. You get your members, however you recruit those, people you don't know, people you do know. You divide up. You kind of look at, okay, so I've got, lucky enough to lease 2,000 acres, let's say, and how many people do I want on that, given the rate the timber company is charging, and hunting pressure, what's the balance that we can find there, so everybody can, I can afford it, the people I invite can afford it, but we don't have, people crawling all over each other in the deer woods. And everybody sort of has an enjoyable experience for the price they're paying. And so you start there, you kind of, decide what the mix is. And a lot of it depends on who organized the thing. My dad, the club still exists, but my dad's no longer in it. I'm no longer in it. I was a member for a while, several years ago. But my dad was a member of a club for years that was actually put together in like 1972. Way back, that one of my dad's good longtime friends put together in Middle Georgia on the Flint River, leasing timber company land. And in fact, the timber company owning the land has changed over the years as various companies have sold each other out. But the club is still there. It's probably one of the longer running, same group of deer hunters in the club in Georgia. But and it just depends on who organized it. Well, the guy who put this together was kind of the guy who didn't mind spending the time putting together rules and kind of serving as the leader and, calling the shots and deciding, everything from, what kind of camper can you bring to the camp to sleep in, and how many people can be in camp on, a weekend. And like you said, how do you decide who hunts where? There's various ways people have done it, from having, a map on a pin board where it's first come, first serve. And you get there in the morning or whatever, and you put your pin on the board and saying, I'm going here. And you've got that stand for, that day. It's any number of ways you want to carve it up. Others have literally areas where, okay, Mark's got his stand down by the creek down there, and that's his area. I don't go in there. I've got to find some other area and put my stand. And you hash it out that way. So a number of different, plans and regimes have come up in ways that hunters have dealt with this. And it raises the question then of rules and what happens with the rule violator. If you got somebody in camp who showed up where he's not supposed to be, or not supposed to be, or hunting somebody's stand when they're not there and they didn't have permission, it's just like any branch of society, just like a workplace where, you got people you get along with, sometimes you got people you don't. And, how do you handle infringements in any corner of society? Well, the hunt club is a microcosm of that. And the leadership, sometimes, like you said, there's a board, and a board votes to decide on the rules and what happens to people who break them. And so, yeah, it's a mini little political world in many hunt clubs, and some last. And because they've got, good organization, good core group of people, and some don't last long, and there's turnover. Though generally what you'll find is it can be tough to find a good timber company lease. Timber company leases don't sit out there waiting for people to get them, unless you're talking about a 100-acre clear cut that just is a miserable place and nobody wants to pay the rate. But generally what's available each year is the less desirable stuff. But if you've got a timber company lease on quality land, you don't want to lose it. So people will often put up with, maybe less than desirable conditions with the people they hunt with, or the rules, or they don't necessarily like, how the group's governing everything. But, the alternative is being back out in the cold hunting for a place where you're going to be hunting this fall. And that can be tough. So it's an interesting dynamic.
Wow.
I got a quick question. For those people who don't have, I guess, hunting clubs or hunting leases to go to, does Georgia or maybe the rest of the South, because I lived in Alabama for a while, and Mark, I actually did hunt one bow season down in Alabama.
Oh, wow.
Not a lot because I was really busy with my job back then, but I hunted in a large national forest that allowed hunting. And is there a lot of public ground where you don't necessarily have to lease? I know you mentioned some of the state leases the timber ground, but is there any, I guess, property in the South that is strictly public ground that guys can go to whenever they want?
Sure. We've got public land just like y'all do. We've got national forest land. We've got state-owned WMA land, federal refuges. Yeah, we've got all that too. And I know it varies state to state and around the regions in terms of the percent of private versus public land. We've got that too. We got in Georgia, just as an example, we've got WMAs all over the state. I hunt public land myself from time to time. We've got, everything from the wide open WMA that's just state seasons and no quota on numbers of hunters and anybody can go. And we've got the higher quality hunts that are limited by quotas and you apply and get drawn, that are, more desirable. So, I hunt public land too. Now there's plenty of that too. And I guess I didn't mean to imply that every deer hunter in Georgia and the South hunts in a hunting club or in a lease situation. We don't. We've got the other aspects like y'all do where, your neighbor has 100 acres of a farmland and lets you hunt there. Or, your buddy at church brought you in on hunting his granddaddy's land or, whatever. And also just the folks who own their own land or have a small recreational tract, and that number's growing. So we've got all those other aspects, but I think it's the hunting timber company lease that's very common throughout the South that stands out as being something that you don't see in the Midwest and the North. Does that answer your question?
Yes, it does.
And on that to that note, I guess, you mentioned while you were explaining kind of this situation with a lot of these large timber companies, the fact that there's some unique habitat in a lot of parts of the South that's pretty unique compared to maybe what we're dealing with in different parts of the country. Can you share with us what some of those unique habitat types are? I'd love to hear about a handful of those common habitat types across much of the South, and then I'd maybe we'll dive into one or two of those, and get into some details of how you might approach hunting it or how it makes things unique. But I guess at a high level, first question, are there some common habitat types unique to the South? Yeah,
just big picture. And this kind of explains it, I think, or will help explain it in an area where we're talking about, when we talk about the South, we're talking about multiple states. Even within Georgia, you got, we have, I grew up in the coastal plain where sandy soils and palmettos and Spanish moss and live oaks. And we've got everything. You go to North Georgia, just north of here where I am now, and you've got Appalachian Mountains, Blue Ridge Mountains, and everything in between. So we've got a very, wide range of habitat types just within the state of Georgia. But across the face of the South, the dominant kind of pattern, and this can be explained, and I don't know if you want to share this website in your show notes later, but there's a neat website I've been referring to in the last couple of years just for, to help me understand some of this stuff. And it's a site put together by the University of Maryland Department of Geographical Sciences, and it's called Global Forest Change. And it shows the whole world, but you can zoom in on the U.S. And what this thing shows in color is loss of forest, extent of forest cover, gain of forest cover, basically changes in forest cover around the world. And it does it in colors. It shows you, forest that has vanished in the last year or two, forest that has appeared in the last year or two, forest that's been there, in place, unchanged, and forest that doesn't exist. Places like the plains where you don't have forests or agricultural areas. And in real quick, if you could see this thing, it will show you what I'm about to tell you. And if you look at this thing, like I'm telling you, you can toggle this map setting called loss, extent, gain. It's largely reds, greens, blues, purples, those sorts of colors, and black where you don't have forest. And here's what I'm looking at. Across the South, from East Texas to Georgia and up the Atlantic coast to Virginia, you're looking at reds, blues, and purples. And what that is constant forest turnover. That is timber practices in the South. It's not forest loss necessarily, though certainly around areas like Atlanta and other urban centers, you're seeing some forest loss. But by and large, in the majority, we're looking at, in rural areas that I'm well familiar with, we're looking at forest turnover, timber practices of harvesting timber, replanting timber, and growing it again. And what that produces is young forest, a lot of young forest cover. Whether you were talking about a clear cut, 100 acres that was just clean cut last year and they're going to come in and replant it in pine, or you're talking about a 1, 2, or 3 year old what we call planted pines. It's that clear cut replanted in rows of pines, or just a select cut where they've come in and cut certain trees and left others to regenerate, certain pine trees to regenerate pine or hardwood growth. But anyway, this timber process turns over and creates a lot of young forest cover. And that's the big picture of what we deal with in the South. When you look at this map, what you see in the Northeast is a lot of bright green, and that is mature forest that is not seeing turnover. And when you look in the Midwest, even southern Michigan and southern Wisconsin, southern Minnesota, but across Illinois, Iowa, Ohio, you see a lot of black. That's farmland. Interspersed with tiny little threads of green, just a barest little blush of bright green of, mature hardwoods. So, in a nutshell, what you're seeing is the Midwest, where you don't have much forest compared to open agricultural lands, and the Northeast, where you have a lot of forested cover, but it is mature hardwood forest that is rarely turned over, versus the South, where it is highly active in timber production and timber rotation, thinning, cutting, clear cutting, replanting, and growing timber. And that produces, as I said before, what hunters are faced with, what I'm faced with when I go hunting in the South, is a lot of cover. It's good in a way. It's a lot of cover and a lot of forage for deer, but it makes it tough to hunt deer because we don't have, you talk about funnels and bottlenecks. I don't know what that is. Really, in the South, most hunters find it difficult to identify what Midwesterners talk about as a bottleneck or a funnel, because we're dealing with 200, 300, 400 acre clear cuts that are 2 years old and neck deep in briars. We're dealing with the same size in planted pines. We're dealing with thin timber that's developed a very good understory. Again, good things. These are good for wildlife and particularly deer forage and deer cover, but makes it mighty tough to predict specific deer movements, especially if you're talking about in bow range of one. So big picture, that's kind of, when you say habitat differences or habitat types, there's kind of the key that explains a lot of what differs in lingo and hunting approach and habitat management South compared to everywhere else.
Yeah, that's it definitely sounds very different compared to much of what Dan and I operate within here in the Midwest. So with that being the case, then let's just operate under this assumption that a significant amount of the southern hunters are facing those types of circumstances, that kind of habitat. How in the heck do you figure out how to hunt those places? I mean, let's start at a high level, Lindsay. How do deer use that terrain? I know that here in the Midwest, right, we can easily identify bedding areas, we can easily identify feeding areas, and then it's not too difficult to figure out how they get from A to B. And then a lot of our hunting strategy revolves around that. But in a situation like you shared, huge timber, maybe really new timber or clear cuts or these different types of deals, how do you personally go about figuring out how deer behave there and then hunt them?
Trail cameras are a big part of it. Now, I know that's true where y'all are. I know, there's not a deer hunter anywhere in North America that doesn't love and use trail cameras. And in many cases, to pattern deer they want to hunt. And those, of course, are a key. But, by and large, it comes down to, and again, much of what I'm going to say here won't surprise you. Y'all do it too. Keying on food sources, keying on where are the does during November, during the rut. Which November didn't necessarily the rut in the South. We've got plenty of areas where, in coastal Georgia where I'm from, the rut is in late October. You get down into Florida, it's even earlier. You get into Alabama, it's even later. So we're kind of all over the map in terms of rut peak, although most of it is November like you guys. But in November, it's where the doe's going to be. Getting somewhere where you can see a long way. A lot of folks, particularly on timber company land, will hunt a clear cut, get in a climber and get a big tall pine tree and get where you can see a long way. And make sure make sure that your rifle is dialed in and you've shot it at 300 yards. because when the deer are moving, that's your best opportunity to really get your eyes on a mature buck. And when you look at some of the data, like in our whitetail report, and I know you've already visited with Kip about the whitetail report, and I don't want to get into that too much, but if you look at our latest whitetail report, look at deer harvest by weapon type, what you see is in the South, it's dominated by rifles, and not so much by bows and muzzleloaders, whereas in the Midwest and Northeast, you see a lot higher harvest with bows and less with rifles. I think that's probably a factor also of in the South. We have a lot longer firearm season traditionally in many states than you do in the North and Midwest. So we spend a lot more time hunting with rifles, but I think a lot of it too has to do with that tendency of much of the habitat we hunt being fairly thick and trying to get somewhere where you can see a long way. Now, we certainly have bottomland hardwoods, which is kind of the equivalent of the mature hardwoods you see in the Northeast, or the mature hardwood fingers and creek bottoms and drainages in between ag fields you see in the Midwest. That's our open hardwoods, is, riverine floodlands, floodplains, where we have a lot of the oak species, white oaks and swamp chestnut oaks and others that produce the mast, particularly swamp chestnut oaks that fall later in the year. That can be where you'll see does and, of course, the bucks during November when the rut's on. But generally, folks are trying to get where they can see a long way. Food plots, of course, play a big role in it. I think I really can't speak to how important food plots are to hunters in the Midwest and Northeast, though I know, they like them. You guys like food plots just as much as we do, but food plots are a key for many hunters in the South. Particularly a lot, say, that are hunting a timber company lease where you're dealing with a lot of young pines and maybe a lot of clear cuts, and you've got forage and browse pretty much across the landscape coming up in that young forest. So, providing a food plot with something that is green on into the cooler season, like, cereal grains or oat, clover, like brassicas, that's going to be attractive, particularly, into December and January. Those are key. Unfortunately, many of us overhunt them because of that. Many people think of food plots as being the place to go, and they can be, as we all know, just like y'all know. It's just like anything else. If you overpressure it, it's not going to be good. You're not going to see mature bucks on food plots, regardless if you're overpressuring it. So from a behavioral standpoint, deer, just like y'all's deer, they respond to pressure. They behave and act in response to how we behave and act. And, sometimes the predictability comes with predicting places where you haven't been and working around your own pressure. So food plots are important. Reading pressure is important. And trail cameras, really delineating where a buck's home range is on your property that you can hunt. We all know that, unless you've got thousands of acres, we know that most of us out there are hunting 100, 200 acres maybe at the most. That's not going to contain the average buck's home range in most cases. He's going to overlap you, or maybe, cover 3/4 of your property with his home range or whatever. So using that trail camera, once you identify a buck you like, that you'd really love to see during hunting season, using your trail cameras to really define what parts of your property that you can hunt. And I don't mean to say property in terms of implying ownership, but wherever you're hunting, using that trail camera to delineate that buck's home range and how it overlaps where you hunt and where he's using those areas most often to help you kind of intersect with him during the rut, all while trying not to pressure him out of that area. So a lot of that would sound familiar to you, I'm sure, right?
Yeah, there definitely is. But I think to your point, it seems like there's definitely some unique reasons why it might be even more important where you guys are at with that type of terrain, because, like we talked about, I think terrain and the lack of cover in some areas can help us in the Midwest, kind of assume deer movement, because it's just obvious there's going to be certain areas they are or are not going to travel. Versus, I think in these types of habitats, as you mentioned, you can't make those types of assumptions. So I can totally understand how a trail camera has a disproportionately higher value to start learning some of those things that in other places you might be able to assume. So it's interesting. Dan, what do you think about all this?
I have a question in regards to, I guess, weather and temperature specifically. I mean, I lived in Atlanta for about 6 months, and it was hot down there, and it was hot all the time, and even in December when I was down there. And my question is, I've never really, I hunted that one year in Alabama, and it flurried for maybe a day, and it didn't even accumulate on the ground, and they closed schools. Up here in Iowa, a foot of snow and it's a 2-hour delay. But what I'm getting at is, does temperature down there affect deer because it is warmer down there differently than the Midwest? And the reason I ask is we all try to get in the stand when there's a huge weather pattern coming through and we know the temperature is going to drop drastically. Is that same thing happening down there?
Yes, it is. Same thing. I would have said just what you just said. We all try to get in the woods when there's a front coming through, and the temperature is going to drop, the barometric pressure is going to swing, and we know that that bluebird day when the winds finally settle the day after the front's gone through or 2 days after, man, they're going to move, particularly in November. So it's hotter. I mean, I burned a thermocell the entire deer season this year, literally. November, December, into January when our season wrapped up, I had my thermocell with me smoking the whole time.
Yikes.
To keep the mosquitoes off. It's not always that way. Y'all know everybody had an abnormally warm fall this year. But yeah, pretty much through November, you better have some bug spray or mosquito repellent. So yeah, it's warmer, but the deer still respond, which I think is interesting too, that maybe this explains why, I encountered the term buck pole, which seems to be something you guys do where everybody hangs their deer and comes to see it. And we don't do that here, because if you hang your deer for a couple of hours and wait for somebody to come see it, it's going to be spoiled. So we don't, and I remember visiting some family during deer season one time in New Jersey, and we were riding around and I saw deer just swinging from people's trees in the yard, and looked like they'd been there. Like people had, shot a deer over the weekend and was letting it age in a tree. And I can see where you could do that. Well, you can't do that here. And maybe even, I don't know, we have walk-in coolers all over the place. That's a phrase you may not hear in the North, walk-in cooler, but a deer hunter in the South knows what a walk-in cooler is. It's a place you can put your deer other than in a physical cooler with ice. So yeah, weather certainly plays a role there in terms of things like that, like how long you can leave your deer out and take it around to show people before you got to do something else with it. But from a deer behavior standpoint, no, they respond the same way your deer do to swings in temperature, swings in barometric pressure, high winds, rainy fronts, and certainly, that's what you're always hoping for in the South. Is you hope for that post-frontal bluebird day, cool or deep cold, calm day to align with your weekends, and not happen on a Tuesday, Wednesday when you got to be at the office or at work. So yeah, same thing.
So I got a question for you, Lindsay, related to that. You might have heard the episode. We had Matt Ross on the show last October or November, I think it was last November, and we talked about the science of the rut. And in that discussion, Matt showed a series of different studies that have been conducted across the country that disputed a lot of commonly held beliefs that we deer hunters have about how weather systems or the moon or different things might or might not influence deer movement. A lot of things you mentioned there that me and Dan and all of our guests talk about a lot that we have seen and believe impact deer movement. But these studies, in some cases, seem to say that no, those things aren't impacting deer movement. I'm assuming you probably saw these same things. I think you've probably written about it, published some things about some of these studies. How do you explain some of that, where there's these commonly held beliefs that I think most of us agree, like, gosh, we've seen it happen so many times, but some of this data coming out of these studies is, not showing that. How do you explain that, or what are your thoughts on some of those?
I don't know. I struggle with that too, just like y'all do. I mean, as communications director for QDMA, that we base what we tell folks on the science. And if, you look at a number of peer-reviewed scientific studies and they all seem to be pointing in a direction that really doesn't jive with what you've been experiencing, we can go to many examples over the years where something hunters assumed, even me included, about deer behavior shown to be completely incorrect, when a number of good, sound scientific studies looked at that. So I struggle with that too, because just like I just said, man, it sure feels like those calm, cold days in November are when you see more deer. and that the deer seem to move. And I do feel like I've hunted through the hot, buggy weather and felt like, man, they're just not moving. You just seem to have that. I mean, don't you just seem to have that instinct when you're in the woods that it just doesn't feel like anything's moving? So I don't know how to reconcile that, other than maybe it's the fact that we have this ingrained idea that that's when you go, and we don't go when it's warm. And that can certainly play a role in what, if you're not in the woods when it's hot because you believe they're not going to move till this weekend when the cold front breaks, how can you compare? And I don't know. That's the only thing I can figure is just across the masses of deer hunters, most of us go when we think conditions are good, and so that's when you see the deer. Certainly the evidence is there that the movement rates are the same. Look at breeding data on the rut. Hunters seem to feel, and I know I've been there too, where you think, man, there just wasn't a rut this year. Man, they just weren't moving. I didn't see the bucks. I didn't see the does. The rut didn't happen, or it was late, or it was early, or it was a trickle rut. We have all these terminologies we talk about, and year in, year out, the scientific data, the data coming from backdating fetuses from does harvested in late season or various other studies and ways they get at this data shows year in, year out, the does are bred the same time every year. So even when it's hot and we're thinking, man, the rut ain't happening, guess what they're doing? They're breeding. So the science is there that despite what we perceive, deer are doing things sometimes that really go contrary to what we think they're doing or believe, after years of hunting they're doing. So yeah, I struggle with those same questions as a hunter. I still would, maybe it's just because of the mosquitoes, I still would rather be out there on that, 20-degree morning in November with calm, clear skies than, 85 degrees and burning a thermocell and sweating. So I don't know.
Yeah, I can definitely relate to that. I couldn't imagine having to use a thermocell all year because, man, those couple early season hunts every year where there are mosquitoes, A, I hate it, and B, thank goodness for thermocells. This is, I guess, we're kind of giving a strong endorsement here for thermocell, unintended, but man, they do work.
They work, and it's funny you say that because thinking about hunting memories and culture and that kind of thing. When I first started going hunting with my dad when I was little, and I was too small to carry a gun, I was just sitting on the deer stand with him, which is again brings up another topic of hunter safety. How we used to climb the trees with nobody I knew on the safety harness, but I'd go climb up in the lock hole with my dad, and I'd sit at his feet on the bottom part of the lock hole, and that's how I'd go hunting with him, and. There was a product then, I don't know if they still make it, called Muskol, Muskol. You ever heard of that?
I don't think I have.
And it's 100% DEET, I think. Basically just what's in today's, bug repellent sprays, but it was in a little plastic bottle. It was kind of an oily type liquid, and you just put a few drops on your hand and rubbed it on your ears and your neck and your face to keep the bugs off. And the smell of that stuff, today, if I got a whiff of that, man, that would take me back. That's like for some people, the smell of a Coleman lantern in deer camp, or the smell of their wool hunting jacket, or for whatever, everybody has those smells that take them back to those memories. And for me, and I bet you would find if you surveyed southern deer hunters and said, how many of you are taken back by the smell of mosquito repellent, it's going to be a high percentage. But
that's awesome. That's funny. Interesting. It's that is definitely one of those. It's so funny, like you mentioned, there's so many different small, cultural things or application type things that are just a little bit different in the South that could have, larger implications or are a reflection of larger differences like that. There was about 17 things in the last 5 minutes that you mentioned that I want to dive into further. One of those is we talked a little bit about timing and how deer move as are influenced, or how deer move in relation to different factors, and you talked about the moon and the rut, and how the rut seems to be pretty consistent, year after year, despite what we may see. I do know, and as I know you mentioned earlier, that the rut is a little bit different in different places in the South. Can you elaborate on that a little bit? That's something we haven't covered a ton in the past, but the rut is definitely a totally different thing in the South. It seems like, at least in parts of the South. Can you tell us how it's different, why it might be different, and what that means for guys hunting down there trying to figure out how to hunt the rut?
Yeah. Basically, kind of the underlying machinery there is deer rut longer and at various times, earlier or later in the South, because they can. In the north, you know how it works, that if given the extremes of seasons and forage availability and the harshness of winter, that fawn needs to hit the dirt at a certain time period during the year in a fairly narrow window to have, adequate forage for the mother and the milk and adequate forage for weaning so that that fawn achieves a certain body size so that it can survive the following winter. We don't have that. We don't have that pressure or survival pressure on fawns in the south. And as you go further into Central America, it's even less so. And what you find is down in Central America, whitetail species breed almost year round. And again, because they can, because it doesn't matter when the fawn hits the dirt. Forage and winter and weather and climate are not going to be a survival pressure in most cases. And you see some different things here, like in certain areas that flood seasonally, the Mississippi and certain areas like that flood seasonally, or the Everglades of Florida, where breeding is timed with putting fawns on the dirt when they're not going to drown. And they might, breed at a completely different time. But in general, as you go further south, it often, the breeding dates can spread out over time. And we certainly see that. We do have, I believe, a less defined rut, though certainly, they're getting the majority of the business done over 2 to 3 weeks in November or whenever the peak might be in a certain area. But that bell curve distribution of early and late breeders is probably broader in the South. You got a lot more early breeders, a lot more late breeders. We felt one of the places I hunt in Middle Georgia, we felt really strongly that the rut was, pretty strong in the first 2 weeks of November. That was kind of our peak, November 1 to November 15. And then late season, we killed a couple does that did have fetuses in them, and we did measure them and backdated them to mid-October. So, there's breeding going on fairly early, fairly late. At my family's land in southeast Georgia down near the coast, like where I said we have an earlier rut, it's in late October. And you see that in coastal Georgia and coastal South Carolina and into Florida and along the Gulf Coast too, you see a October rut. And again, it's, mostly because historically they could do that. They could breed that early and not worry about fawn survival and fawns being born that early the following winter, spring. So, at my family's land in southeast Georgia, where I said they're breeding mostly, Halloween is a great time to be in the woods. The last 2 weeks of October are great, but, we found fetuses that were conceived in early September and late August. So there. And when you get on down into Florida, it's even crazier. It is, literally 4th of July. As I wrote in an article in the new 2 issues ago in Quality Whitetails, I wrote about some new research that's out on why the mixed up rut in the South, and so many dates all over the calendar. And literally 4th of July, you're in flip flops and some deer somewhere are breeding in Florida.
Jeez.
Now, in Alabama, in Mississippi, and Louisiana, you've got some even later stuff where they're breeding into January and even February, and we think that has more to do with restocking, with moving some deer around, them taking that photo period trigger with them, the day length trigger that triggers breeding, and being moved from another area, whether it was up north or Central America, we're not sure. They came into these areas, and that day length trigger, now was triggered on a different day in the calendar because, as you know, day lengths vary. I mean, right now where you're sitting in Michigan, your day is going to be shorter than my day here in Georgia. So day length is always different wherever you are in terms of latitude. And so that trigger was triggered at a different time for those deer once they were moved. And so these deer in Alabama and these other areas that rut late had a trigger for whatever reason that, led to them breeding late. And they did not have a climate control like you have in the north, where harsh winter would tend to thin out any fawns that came from deer with those genetics. They didn't have that, so those dates persist today.
What are some of the hunting season lengths down south? I think I remember hearing someone say that there are certain seasons or certain states that the very earliest you can hunt, maybe for archery, is in September, and it lasts all the way into February.
Yeah, it varies. And like in Alabama, for example, and Mississippi, and those states that do have those extreme late ruts, they really don't get into their hunting seasons until later, and they will hunt through January. I think there's even some effort here afoot in Alabama lately to try to extend the season, or maybe they did successfully extend it into early February because hunters were saying, look, these deer are still rutting, and we got to quit hunting. But in Georgia where I am, we end up, our bow season usually comes in around mid to third week of September. And then we hunt 4 to 5 weeks. Sometimes we get a muzzleloader primitive weapons week bolted onto that before gun season comes in the 20th, somewhere in there of October. And then we have all three, firearms, bow, and primitive weapons, until early first or second weekend of January. And then we shut it down. South Carolina is even longer with their gun season, and they're known for this. It's insane. Their gun season comes in August 15th. Rifle season. And so it's the longest firearm season in the nation. Runs like we do all the way through January. And so, you'll see people in there. I mean, they look like they're going dove hunting, or at least dove hunting in the South, where you've got shorts and a T-shirt and your boots on, and a cooler full of cold drinks going deer hunting. So, but they start August 15th. But traditionally in the South we do have longer seasons for the most part. That's a surprise often to Southern hunters who find out, like in Pennsylvania, where you've only got a week or 2 weeks, or any other Midwestern, Northern, Eastern states where the firearms hunting is so much briefer, which of course leads to a lot of the traditions you have there, like school shutting down for opening day, because it is such a short window when everybody's in the woods. And certainly opening day of gun season and the other seasons is a big event here for us. But it's a little bit more relaxed in that, if opening day of gun season is October 20-something and it's going to be 80 degrees and, you're not that fired up about it, a lot of us go for the tradition of, I certainly do. I'm never going to miss an opening day, I can tell you that, whether it's bow or gun. But there's also the relief in knowing that, hey, if you go opening weekend, you don't see anything, it's okay. You got November and the rut coming, and a lot of hunting in December and even into January if you need it. So
given the fact that a lot of these states down there have so much longer firearm seasons, from what I've heard and what it sounds like you mentioned there, would you say that there is a significantly different amount of hunting pressure on these deer, and is that changing their behavior compared to what you hear about in some of these other states, like the Midwest and Northeast?
Yeah, it's a good question. I'm not sure I've seen any data on that. Certainly, we've seen plenty of data that shows, just like deer everywhere, that they do respond to pressure. You can anticipate how they'll respond to it fairly accurately. You can change your hunting strategies to ensure you're hunting areas or deer that aren't seeing that kind of pressure, or the pressure is kept to a minimum or whatever. But certainly we know that speaking for Georgia and looking at the data I've seen on this before, that opening weekend of gun season is, pretty much a spike in participation. And then you'll often see a spike. You'll see, one weekend in November will probably be pretty high. And then you'll see a spike around Thanksgiving when, a lot of people have time off and they're going deer hunting, but none of it really compares to the number of people in the woods on opening day. And then it, of course, falls off into December, because by then, the rut's over. You got holidays and family functions coming up. Some people got their venison now in the freezer. They're good. They got their buck. Or they're just, moving on to other things or whatever. Certainly it does drop off in December. And you could play those patterns if you wanted to, but, we're still dealing with the same issues that you have anywhere you have whitetails, which is it's post-rut. The bucks are, trying to recover. You can work some post-rut patterns in terms of food. But if you at that point, you have to have a food plot or an area with food at that time of year that hasn't already been pressured into the dirt. And that can be a good strategy, is to plant some food plots and set those aside and not hunt them until, put them in something like a brassica or cereal grain that will be productive still, at least in the South, into December and January, and put it off limits. Don't hunt it. Don't let anybody else hunt it. And just tell them, this is our late season, post-rut, find a buck strategy here. But again, most areas by that time have been pressured pretty heavily, and it can be tough. It can be very tough to find a pattern on the bucks, especially post-rut in the South.
On that food plot topic, I guess 2 questions. Number one, are there any unique things that you need to consider when planning food plots in the southern part of the country? Number one, I guess. Well, let's just go there. food plots, is there anything unique when it comes to the food plot standpoint that people in the South need to be thinking about different than I do up here in Michigan?
Not really. We certainly got a longer growing season, and that affects, that's one of the things I had to learn was the difference between, a warm season food plot in South versus North. That in the North, you guys in many areas can grow clover spring planted, and we can't do that here in Georgia. It'll burn up in the summer. It won't, and unless you've got it in somewhere very moist and shady where it can survive through the summer. But a large, food plot, half acre of clover is not going to make it through the summer. You need to be planting it in the fall, and getting it started that way. So clover, is not really a warm season planting for us, and I know it works that way in a lot of other examples. Even brassicas and cereal grains and other things like that can be planted during the summer in the North, and we can't do that here. But at the same time, our growing season extends further into hunting season. We're not seeing plots shut down. Our earliest frosts are coming in, and freezes are coming in November at best. And this past year it was even December and later before, particularly in southern Georgia and in the deep South, before we saw any serious cold this year. So those plots are continuing to grow and be productive, and by the time late season comes around, late December, late January, those brassicas, those cereal grains or whatever are really kicking it, and it can be a good strategy. And the deer are not having to dig through snow to find it. So, we're not seeing that. I'm sitting here, by the way, looking at a buck on my wall that was, I killed him in 2004. He's my best buck ever. I killed him on my family's land in coastal Georgia. At the time, he was the number 2 buck in the county. And that's something we can talk about too, is the importance of measuring your success where you stand versus comparing it to other regions, which is important in the South. But he was the number 2 buck in the county at the time. He's now, I think, number 4. He's kind of bumped on down the list in the more recent years. But he netted 139. He grossed 149. He was 5.5 years old. I killed him on Christmas Eve.
Wow.
And which is basically a dead zone for us in deer season. But it happened that year at our farm that we had a food plot through whatever, we had set it aside. It had brassicas in it that we had planted. And it got I don't think it had any pressure at all during that hunting season. My family members and ours and myself had just not hit that for whatever reason that year. It wasn't like we set it aside and said, don't hunt this later, but through chance it hadn't been hunted. And me and my family were heading to the farm that Christmas Eve to be there with my dad for Christmas, and we got there, shortly after lunch on Christmas Eve, and my son Jake was 4 at the time. 6. He was 6 years old at the time, and he was just aching to go deer hunting, and it was terrible weather. A front was coming through. It was going to rain all day on Christmas. It was nasty. It was already misting rain when we got there, and it was kind of, just ugly weather. Wind was blowing, and I told Jake, I was like, it's kind of nasty. You sure you want to go deer hunting? He's like, yeah, Dad, let's go. And thank goodness he did. And my dad said, y'all ought to go down to the Swamp Road, is what we named this plot, because nobody's been there. And he said, I looked at it the other day, and the deer are really hitting it. So we went, and 30 minutes later, out stepped this buck, stood there. He had a mouthful of brassica when I shot him. So, to me, that example is just what we were just talking about, having a food plot or area set aside with cool season forage in it, something that will be productive late, when it might be colder, and that has not been pressured. And that could be your go-to spot after the rut's over, after the bucks and does have all been pressured to death, and, the bucks are worn out and they're looking for food. And there's no doubt that front, I think, played a role too, because the deer were really moving that afternoon. It was nasty weather for a hunter, but there was a long front coming through. The barometric pressure really was changing, and I really believe, here we go again, me saying something that kind of is contradicted by the science, but I really believe that that buck was there because he needed the food, and he was in an area that had not been pressured.
All right. Now, given the fact that we're on the topic of food plots, we need to pause this conversation for just a quick minute for a word from our sponsors of this episode, the Whitetail Institute of North America. And if you're not familiar, Whitetail Institute is one of the foremost food plot seed companies in the country, and the folks who run this company are some of the most experienced food plot users you'll ever find. So with that said, today I wanted to share an important food plot tip from Whitetail Institute employee John Cooner about the importance of soil tests. So whether you hunt in the north, south, or in between, this is an important thing to learn about.
the most important thing you can do is a laboratory soil test. And we hammer and hammer and hammer about that. It is so critical for a couple of reasons. One is for soil pH. That's the most important. This was a big light bulb that came on in my head when I first understood this. I went, oh, my gosh. It used to be we'd plant a food plot, didn't look too good, throw some more fertilizer on it. When I finally figured out what soil pH means, I guess is the word, it really turned on the light bulb for me. It's basically a measurement of how well a plant can get nutrients out of the soil, okay? Mm-hmm. And different plants have different ranges that are optimum for them. Most high-quality deer forages like to have soil pH around 6.5 to 7.5, right in there. We'll just call that neutral for our purposes. Most fallow soils are lower than that. They're acidic. And what happens is this. The lower the soil pH goes below the optimum range for the plants you're putting in, the more the nutrients in the soil are bound up in a way that plants can't access them. And I'll give you an example of how that works. Let's say you had a soil with a food plot with a soil pH of 5.0, and you went out there and you bought $100 worth of fertilizer, put it out, and planted a high-quality deer forage. You might as well have just taken $50 and thrown it down the drain because the plants can't get about half the nutrients in the fertilizer.
So there you go. If you'd like to learn more, you can visit whitetailinstitute.com. And now, let's get back to the show. Yeah, I think that's a great piece of advice for a lot of areas in general. Just having, keeping an area like that safe and pressure-free till later in the season when, so many of these deer are searching out, trying to find somewhere they can get to away from all the hunters. And if that happens to be on your property where you can hunt, you can have a significantly greater amount of success than a lot of the other people in your area that don't have that kind of safe place left. Takes a little bit of self-control, but I think it can really pay off.
And it doesn't necessarily have to be a food plot. A lot of people, particularly these hunters I'm talking about that are on a hunting lease, or public land or whatever, are looking at me and saying, yeah, you had that private farm or you had a food plot you could set aside. And this is true, but it doesn't necessarily have to be a food plot, because like we said, in a hunting club scenario where you have put as many guys on there as you can to keep the lease rates down for everybody, and there's not a lot of spare room. There's not a lot of ability to plant a food plot and say, nobody touch this till December. That can be tough to do, and particularly on public land too. So it doesn't have to be a food plot. Those places are still there. You need to break out the map, and you need to ask yourself, what's the ugliest place on here that nobody's hunted, that everybody said, that place sucks, I'm not going there, or, for whatever reason, didn't go there. And that's where you can go. It doesn't have to be a brassica food plot. It might be a thicket. It might be just some rugged hillside that people didn't want to bother going down. And it can do the exact same thing. There's a great story I encountered a few years ago, back before I worked for QDMA, writing about a kid who had killed this massive buck. He was in a hunting club with his dad. The morning came, he went to the pin-in board, and he had his heart set on a particular stand. He knew where he was going. And when he got to the pin-up board, a member of the club had already put his pin in that stand. And of course, the kid's heart was broken, but nothing they could do. That was the rules. His dad couldn't say anything. That was the rules. A member of the club had gotten there to the pin-up board before the kid did. And there were no other stands left, no other, quote, good stands left. So this kid literally just in kind of frustration jabs his pin in this clear cut right next to the camp, grabs his climber, and beats his way through the brush in the dark, literally a stone's throw outside camp till he finds a tree he can climb, gets up in it, daylight comes up, and what's the first thing he sees? This monster buck. And it's such a great example. Yeah. Here's all these other stands that everybody thought were the, quote, good stands. They were fighting over them. When somebody could have gone into this nasty clear cut nobody wanted to hunt and had not hunted all year, right there by the camp, and killed this buck.
That's a perfect example of that. That's and I think that probably happens a lot where you have, I think a lot of these, you see these examples where a random young person or random new hunter, shoots this ginormous buck because they just chose to go some willy-nilly place that nobody else ever thought of hunting. And that's where the big deer are because they've been avoiding all these other quote-unquote smart hunters who have been hunting the good spots over and over and over. Then the new guy goes to the unhunted spot, and there you go.
Yeah,
that's
right.
That's a great story. So So you mentioned food plots and you mentioned some different habitat things. I want to make one note for anyone looking for a really great food plot resource. You need to take a look at a book that Lindsay, I believe you edited and contributed to. Correct me if I'm wrong, but Quality Food Plots, published by the QDMA, is the best food plot book and resource I've ever seen. So right there, I mean, you have to check that book out if you are trying to, better utilize food plots or get into food plots. I'm correct on that, Lindsay, right? You did contribute and or edit that, right?
Yeah, myself and Kent Kammermeyer, who's a wildlife biologist, and Dr. Carl Miller from the University of Georgia, who's a professor of wildlife ecology. We were the three editors on it. And we, I appreciate you, the compliment on that. And all I can tell you is what we did was sit down and say, the phone always rings at QDMA with people asking food plot questions. And we said, dadgummit, let's put together a resource that will answer all of these questions that we answer over and over and over every day on the phone. So that was the goal of the book, was a food plot guide for wherever you stand, north, south, east, west, no matter your soils, to basically take it from soil to planting techniques, to understanding the animal and what it's after to eat, all of that. And then, of course, all the various species you could potentially plant. That's how we put it together.
Yeah, well, I think you definitely achieved that goal of covering almost any question that somebody could possibly come up with. When I first got into food plotting, that was one of the first things I read, and it put me in such a great position to succeed and have a good start. So highly recommend that to anyone out there with that type of interest. Now, I want to flip the page a little bit on that. You mentioned, food plots aren't the only way you can, have this great late season honey hole or whatever it might be. When I hear what you've talked about when it comes to habitat in the South, you mentioned there's lots of cover, lots of new cover. With that being said, other types of habitat improvements other than food plots, are they less important in the South compared to maybe up here? Because up here there's a lack of cover, so improving our cover is a really important thing in a lot of areas. Is that not true in the South, or what are other habitat improvements of importance there?
Well, it's you're right. We've got kind of this cover everywhere you look, and it makes it tough, as I said, on the hunting, on predicting deer movements. I mean, heck, it even makes it tough shed hunting. I have found sheds in two primary locations. One in food plots, cool season plots, which of course we all know that. That's one of the places you want to look. Any place a buck would have been feeding after, at the time he's going to be shedding those antlers. And the second one is in woods we have just burned. A big part of my shed collection includes antlers that are blackened from fire because, other than that, it's just pure luck that you step on a shed because of all the cover. Fire is one of those things, we use it to maintain timber. The forest industry uses it for timber, but it is great for wildlife. I love hunting turkeys in an area that just burned where the new green growth is coming back. And that's something we do commonly, and it's interesting to me that I don't see that as much in the north, except maybe burning, grassland CRP there. I saw some data the other day from I believe it was the Prescribed Fire Council, and it said some data from like 2014 where, in the total acreage burned with prescribed fire nationwide in 2014 was 11 million acres. 8 million of those were in the southeast.
Wow.
So, for example, in that year in Georgia, we burned over 1 million acres with prescribed fire. In Michigan, your home state, you guys burned 15,000 acres that year with prescribed fire.
Jeez.
So, north to south, prescribed fire is something we use a lot. And again, we wouldn't find many sheds without it. But we use that regularly, and I think it's something that could be used more in the north. As I've heard Dr. Craig Harper say before, though, and it's the truth, fire really doesn't do much for you if there's no sunlight. So if while you could burn, say, a mature hardwood stand carefully and not damage the hardwoods, if there's no sunlight hitting the ground, the fire doesn't do much for you. The fire sets back that understory, disturbs the soil a little bit, gives you that flush of growth from the seed bank. But if there's no sunlight hitting the ground, it's not going to help. So it really only works in kind of timber stands that you have thinned, or clear cut recently where you're getting, or like a thinly planted, say, longleaf pine stand or something like that, where you're getting a lot of sunlight on the ground. And I know that in the north and the Midwest, fire is maybe made more difficult by local regulations or state regulations, by the fact that it's just traditionally not used or discouraged even by state agencies, and there's not as much support as we have in the South. I mean, here in the South, the state forestry agencies will really help you in a big way get fire done. and done safely. And I know you don't have as many resources there, but fire is one of those unique things. So, but yeah, in general, like you said, we don't have the need to produce a lot of cover, and certainly not bedding cover or fawning, particular types of cover, unless in an area where, there certainly can be areas where it's lacking through traditional management on a particular property. I mean, every property can be different, but we're generally not having to go out there and produce cover. We are having to do things like change what that cover is in, for example, invasive species. Because our growing season is so long compared to the north, where, I'm sitting here looking out the window at green leaves budding right now. And, it goes right on into the fall, before we have any hard frost that slow that down. We got a long growing season. That's a good thing in some ways, good for, producing forage and cover, good for producing timber, which is why we got a lot of the history there in timber management and timber company land ownership. But it's also good for producing, privet and kudzu and autumn olive and all the other invasive species that are a problem, that are counterproductive to good deer habitat. And so a lot of what we do is removing those species, killing privet, even killing a lot of sweet gum, which is a native tree, but it's kind of the kudzu of the tree world. It here in the South, it pops up. It's the first species to pop up in any disturbed ground, any cutover, clear cut, logging deck, fire break trail, whatever. Sweet gum is going to respond, and it will quickly thicken up, choke out, and beat out all the other desirable trees and shade the ground. And for years, you're going to have a locked out understory, and that's true whether it's sweet gum or autumn olive or a privet head that, privet bay that has kind of headed out and is ruining the understory. So a lot of what we do when it comes to, like you said, managing habitat and cover is controlling the unwanted stuff. That's interesting. So that the good stuff can grow.
Yeah, definitely some different things there. That statistic you shared about the difference in burning from north to south is really interesting. And I think, like you mentioned, there's definitely some tradition or cultural differences there where it just isn't such a common practice here because just other people haven't done it. But to your point, now I've never done prescribed burns myself, but hearing from so many people like yourself and others, or Dr. Grant Woods or whomever it might be, there just seem to be so many benefits there that if you can pull it off, there really does seem to be some value there.
Basically it is. It's just another tool for rotating and turning over forest succession, just like we were talking about earlier with the timber practices, just like thinning timber, cutting timber, clear cuts, whatever. All of that is doing the same thing that, a hinge cut does or any other aspect of timber management that is turning back time on that forest succession, changing an old, mature, canopied forest with no understory back into a young forest that encourages shrubs and vines and forbs and briars and all the good stuff that deer hide in and browse on. And fire is just another tool for that.
Yeah, and that's a great advice for anyone, no matter what region you're in, trying to achieve that type of goal, whether it's with fire or another tool. That's something that's going to definitely help the deer in your area. And if you can adjust to that with your hunting strategy, it can help your hunting too. Dan, what are you wondering over there? Where's your head on all this?
I'm just absorbing everything. I like you said at the very beginning, there's definitely a lot of differences, but there's a lot of similarities too.
Yeah, a lot we can apply. A lot we can take.
Like I said, it's the little things,
Now, speaking of something you mentioned a little while ago that just stuck in my head, I took note of it. We'd been talking about some of the different studies, taking a step away from habitat maybe. You'd mentioned some of these different studies. I believe that you went to the Southeast Deer Study Group recently, which is, as I understand it, kind of an event where all sorts of researchers and various folks in the deer world come together and share different insights, discoveries, research results from over the past year or so. What stood out to you from that event this past year, Lindsay? Is there any new research that stood out to you that you found particularly interesting, maybe that's relevant to the South or anywhere?
Yeah, there's always good stuff there. Sometimes some of it can be seem repetitive because, the way that science works, and it's a good thing for all of us, whether you're talking about disease research, human disease research, or deer research, is somebody does a study, they look at something, and then often that study is replicated. Somebody else does it to see if they get the same or similar or different results. And over time, that's how we kind of get dialed in on certain information. It's happened with coyote predation. As somebody kind of discovered, man, coyotes are really whacking the fawns in this location. A lot of people started doing coyote studies as well to see in different areas or under different circumstances were they finding the same thing. So sometimes it can be repetitive. You're hearing somebody give, a talk on something that kind of was news 3, 4, 5 years ago, but it's just as important that these, follow-up and studies be done to confirm. I mean, the analogy I always use is, putting bullets on paper and looking at your group. And if you got 6 shots in a 1 or 2 inch group, you're looking pretty good. But if one of those went off to the left somewhere, your rifle's not grouping off to the left. That was an outlier. And scientific studies it works the same way. The more studies you've got grouping in that tight group, the more you feel confident about the findings and the takeaways from that study. So this year there was a lot of more information about coyotes, reaffirming some of the things we thought we knew already. There was some cool stuff on buck movements. Again, reaffirming some of the stuff we saw. There was a couple of new studies looking at hunting pressure that were cool and had a lot of neat new angles, but in the end kind of told you, I could tell you, Mark, there was, and Dan, there's a couple of studies on hunting pressure. What do you think they found? And you probably tell me, well, deer respond to hunters, and you can go where hunters aren't, or at times hunters aren't, and see more deer. And I'd say, yep, you got it. So, but it's always interesting to see these studies come out with stuff that's useful to deer hunters, and and that's why we're there. One of the ones that jumped out to me was a study out of Texas by Aaron Foley, working at Texas A&M Kingsville, where he did looked at data from a lot of buck harvests over a lot of years, and data that they had, and found that the average 5.5-year-old buck loses 24% of his body mass from the pre-rut to the post-rut.
Jeez. That's
just incredible to me. That is, a 200-pound man dropping to 150 pounds in 2 months.
Wow.
So that kind of stuff to me always is very, very neat.
So it sounds like if there was a limited breeding season, a lot of guys would be a lot thinner these days.
That's right. If you had to chase them. Yep. If they would just run from us, we'd all be in a lot better shape.
Oh, man. Well, for me and Dan, that might have been the case already. Oh, geez. That's interesting, though. Very interesting. I didn't mean to disrupt your story. Was there any more on that research study you wanted to share?
No, and there's an article on at QDMA.com on the homepage. It's linked of the 10 stats. I think, in fact, I think it made your Friday morning mashup the week I put it out, and I appreciate that.
Yeah.
But it's the 10 kind of big number takeaways I brought home from Deer Study Group. If anybody wanted to see more on that,
definitely. We'll make sure to link that again in the blog post for this show as well, because there was some great stuff there.
And that really, looking at the body weight, and I don't know if we're getting short on time, I don't want to head you off, but that brought up another point to me about north-south is deer body sizes. I think a lot of hunters don't realize that, both, whether you're talking about a southern hunter going north or a northern hunter coming south, we don't realize sometimes the difference in average body sizes. We certainly have areas in the south, some of the richer soils, the Black Belt of Alabama, the Mississippi Valley, where, even the Georgia Piedmont, where you can sometimes get deer on the order of Midwestern and northern body sizes, but for the most part, Georgia coast, Florida, the Gulf Coast, a lot of these areas, coastal North Carolina, is much of the same situation. We're talking about much smaller deer. I've even seen, I remember a couple of years back, a staff member got an adult doe with his bow here at QDMA headquarters in Athens, and we put it on Facebook, and, there were a lot of comments like, WTF, what you want to shoot the baby deer for, dude? And it's like, it's not it's an adult deer. This is an adult doe here in Georgia. And yeah, I understand it's smaller, but I think many times people don't realize that like in coastal Georgia where I hunt, that the average mature buck that we kill is always, it seems like, going to hit right around 160 to 165 pounds on the hoof. And that's a very good deer down there where we are. You know, a doe is going to be running 80 to 100 pounds as an adult. And that's, I don't know what I would do. In fact, a buddy of mine from Jacksonville, Florida, Phil Bancroft, who hunts both in Florida and Georgia and hunts annually in Illinois with a friend who's an outfitter there. You know, he told me the hardest his heart ever beat was when he was sitting there at 15 yards looking at a, 220-pound mature Illinois buck. It just blew him away. So I can't. I hope one day I get to see that.
It definitely does sound different. That's for sure. There are some big-bodied deer up here in this part of the country, and I'm glad you brought this whole difference between northern and southern deer, or deer in different regions in general, because it brings us back to a point you kind of touched on real briefly early on in our conversation, which was this idea of how we set goals or expectations. And I guess I want your thoughts on that. Can you tell me a little bit about, number one, in addition to body size, how do you see deer in general being different in the South, maybe from antler characteristics or age structure? And then number two, how would you say that should influence, or what would your recommendation be for Southern hunters when it comes to setting goals and expectations, given those realities?
Yeah. Well, I mean, you kind of just summed it up, that we have everybody, wherever you stand. I mean, it can be even within your state of Michigan. Or name any other Midwestern state, any state. Within that state, you're going to have micro regions where deer produce different things than they do in others, even county to county sometimes, where you can't expect to produce a deer of a quality that another area might produce. Georgia has those areas, just like I mentioned. Deer, we can produce bigger bodies, bigger antlers here in the Piedmont of Georgia where I work than we can in coastal plain Georgia where my family's land is. But if you understand those limitations locally and you measure your success by that, you won't be disappointed. Just like we're fortunate here in Georgia that the magazine Georgia Outdoor News, which is, like I said, who I used to work for, they have for years collected officially scored bucks in Georgia and organized them by county. And it's a resource you can go look at and see what are the top 10 bucks in your county by net score. And that's a great yardstick to use because rather than worrying about, man, we just can't, I just had never seen a 150 class buck like they see up in middle Georgia, or, a 170 like they see in Illinois. Or Wisconsin or some other state. But if you looked at if you had access to a record book locally, or even if you could just kick around a little bit and talk to friends and who's the best buck, you know of in the county, and had some sense of the top end production in your county, that's a great kind of watermark to go by, a high watermark, and know that, if we're putting a buck every now and then in the top 10 in the county, you're doing great. And in fact, where I hunt, my family's land, we are now, if you look at the top 10 bucks in the county, about half of them have come on our farm or adjacent to it, killed by friends of ours who also practice quality deer management like we do.
Wow.
So that can be, man, that is a very cool thing to know that you're producing some of the best bucks in the county, especially if you took the number one buck you've ever killed and he would just pale in comparison to to the best counties in your state, and certainly to the best counties in other states. That gives you something to be happy about, to measure your progress at, and a very realistic goal for anybody, anywhere you stand and it goes by age. You got to do it by age and protect the younger bucks if you're looking at body size and antler size in any deer. But in particular bucks, if you're looking for the upper end of what, your deer can produce antler-wise, you got to be realistic and understand by age is how you're going to get there. But measuring it locally is the way to go. I don't care where you are. I don't care if you're in Michigan or Iowa or Ohio or Georgia.
Yeah, I think that's such great advice. It's so easy today to be, and right, I think I'm as guilty as anyone because, anyone, I guess, in the hunting related media is a little bit responsible for this. We've shared so many pictures and stories and videos, or the TV shows where you see these giant bucks, and it just seems like it's so easy. But in most cases, for the average deer hunter, those types of situations in deer are not too terribly realistic in a lot of cases. And if we're setting our goals and our hopes and dreams and expectations based on, what Mark Drury killed in southern Iowa, I think a lot of us are going to be pretty frustrated and disappointed when we don't have that same type of deer on our farm. So I love the idea of looking at a local top end and shooting for that and striving to improve what you're already doing maybe, but doing it in a more realistic fashion. I think that's terrific advice.
Yeah, I mean, not to begrudge anybody their great buck. I love looking at them just like anybody else does. But when it turns back to you looking at your trail camera pictures and hanging your stands and looking at the deer you're seeing in the woods and deciding if you're disappointed or not, you've got to remember to wear those local eyeglasses. And the other thing too is pull that jawbone. Every set of antlers in my office I'm sitting here looking at right now, European mounts and then the one shoulder mount, I've got the jawbone hanging with it because they were all 4.5 or 5.5 years old. They were an age that I was shooting for. And that's kind of a point I always like to drive home is I don't care where you are. I don't care about antler score or body size or where you're standing. A 4.5, 5.5-year-old buck and up is a rare animal anywhere and not an easy animal to see or kill. And if that jawbone says he was physically and fully mature, then you should be proud of that. And that's an achievement. I don't care what he scored. I don't care even if he scored low for your average in your area. That was still a very tough deer to produce and a tough deer to see and to hunt, and you ought to be proud of that. And that's why I encourage everybody, save that jawbone. If you don't know how to age it, get somebody who knows how to help you with that and teach you to do it, and hang that jawbone up with those antlers. That's just as much of the story.
Yeah, that's a really great idea. I really should do a better job of keeping those jawbones because, like you said, it really does come down to age. So much of what makes that deer special and a challenge to hunt and produce and see, it's not necessarily, sure, antlers are great and they're fascinating and they're awesome to see, but really it comes down to how old that deer is, what they were able to survive, what they learned, and that's what translates into such a challenging, fulfilling hunt. So I love that. And I guess kind of related to that, we have to wrap things up here, but given what you do for the Quality Deer Management Association, for someone who's listening today that's not a member of the Quality Deer Management Association, there's sometimes a lot of misconceptions about the QDMA. There's some people maybe that just don't know much about it. Is there anything you'd like to tell those people today that aren't members yet that you think they really should understand, or maybe why they might want to consider being a member? Now that we have a little extra time here, anything you want to share on that standpoint?
Oh boy, we almost need to do another show if you want to talk about the misconceptions, not only of QDMA, but of quality deer management in general and what it's about. And that really is why we exist, is to, educate folks on that. Hopefully just, to someone who's listened to this podcast up to this point, what you've gathered is I'm a deer hunter. I'm a deer hunter who hunts public land, private land. I understand and do a lot of the same things you do and experience the culture and appreciate the same things. And I'm a deer geek. I love learning about them. I love the science, and that's really what we're about. We talk about how we measure success in memories, not inches of antler. And again, nothing wrong with Crockett score or antler. We all love a big buck too, but there is so much more to it, and so many more memories that come from hunting a tuned-up deer herd, and sharing that resource and learning about the animal together with other deer hunters, and that's what we're about. We're about, and in the broader picture, QDMA works to ensure we always have those opportunities to have that hunting heritage and that it lasts forever. Not just that we can hunt them, but that we can have quality deer populations and sustainable deer populations and a place to hunt them and a way to hunt them. It's a group that if you believe in deer hunting and you want it to be around, you should be in for that. But the side bonus is we're going to teach you a heck of a lot about deer and how to have better deer hunting where you stand, just like we've been talking about today, that you can have the best deer and the best, most exciting deer hunting where you sit, through some of the things that we've learned about deer and that we'll share with you.
Yeah, well, I can 100% echo those sentiments from an unbiased point of view. I'm a member, but I'm not obviously a member of the staff or anything. I got to tell you that what Lindsay and his team are doing from an education standpoint and all the other things that the QDMA does is really a incredibly positive thing for the deer hunting community. So I would just, I would encourage you, if you're not already a member, take the 5 minutes, go to QDMA.com and sign up. I think it's going to be really difficult for anybody to go and check out what the QDMA is doing and really look at it and see what they're actually doing and talking about on their website straight from the source. I think anyone's going to have a really hard time going and looking at that and seeing something that they can't get behind. I mean, it really is a tremendous organization, and the work you guys are doing is terrific. And like I mentioned early on, the magazine itself is worth the very small dues that you guys ask for every year. It's totally worth it just for that. So visit QDMA.com. I urge you, do that after you listen to this. I think it's just one of the best decisions you'll make when it comes to deer hunting. So, Lindsay, is there anywhere else that our listeners should go to see what you guys are doing or to learn about QDM or the organization at all?
Yeah, I would say talk to our grassroots folks, our volunteers out there in the branches that are in your community. And you can find that through the website you mentioned already, QDMA. When you said that, it hit me. A lot of times when we hear people who have misconceptions about us or QDM, you find out that it's because they really didn't know who we were. And if you go and look at our message, you'll find that, you might learn something that was different than what you thought about us. So I appreciate you promoting the website. It's a good place to go and start. And then through the website, you can get in touch with our branches. We have a branch directory map. We've got them all over the country, wherever there are whitetails. And find some of these folks, reach out to them in your community, go see what they're doing, your neighbors in your community, and what they are doing to educate other deer hunters, to improve deer hunting, to work on habitat locally, to ensure our hunting heritage, to take young hunters hunting for the first time. There's so many great things that our grassroots volunteers are doing out there, and they're your neighbors. So if you got questions, talk to those guys. Get to know them, and maybe you'll find yourself getting involved.
Yeah, that's a great idea and a great recommendation. There's a whole lot of people now that are part of this organization all across the country that provide a kind of a network that you can tap into. I think that I've personally been able to tap into that network here locally in Michigan, and have got to meet so many great friends and new people that love deer hunting just as I do. So in and of itself, that right there is a great place just to build a better deer hunting network, let alone all the other things you can do. So Lindsay, thank you so much. This has been super interesting, and I think really helpful to whether it be hunters in the South or anywhere. I think we all learned something today.
Mark, I sure appreciate it. This will go down in the highlights of my career, was when I got to be on your podcast with you, seriously, because I listened to it, and it's going to be very cool to be a part of it.
Well, Dan had to drop off because he had to go pick up his kids, but if he was here, I know he'd be laughing at that, because he always likes to give us a hard time about how nobody really respects us. So it's nice to hear that you do enjoy what we're doing.
Well, as you know, I have enjoyed following your career from your fairly recent start and your bold move to step out there and do this full time, and I'm envious and an admirer of yours and what you do. You do great work, and keep it up. And thanks for including me.
I really appreciate that, Lindsay. It means a lot. So thank you again so much. Again, everyone listening, I'll make sure to include links to everything we've talked about on the blog post. Be sure to check that out. Head to QDMA.com. And Lindsay, have a great afternoon, and hopefully a terrific shed hunting season or scouting or food plotting season, whatever it is that's coming up next for you.
Same to you, Mark.
All
And
right.
Dan, too.
All right, have a good one. And with that, we are going to call this a wrap. So before we shut things down, though, we need to give a big thank you to our partners who help make the Wired to Hunt podcast possible. So big thank you to Sitka Gear, Trophy Ridge, Bear Archery, Redneck Blinds, Huntera Maps, Ozonics, Carbon Express, Lacrosse Boots, and the Whitetail Institute of North America. Finally, and most importantly, thank you all for joining us today. I hope you enjoyed this show and hopefully learned a thing or two as well. So until next time, have a great week and stay wired to hunt.
I'm sure a lot of you guys remember the old ceremonial hunting tradition of eating the heart out of the first animal you kill. Meat from those organs are among the most nutrient-rich foods on the planet. You can get those same benefits your ancestors craved via convenient daily capsules from Heart and Soil. Find out more at heartandsoil.co. And remember, use code MeatEater for 10% off your purchase.
Outdoor adventure won't wait for engine problems. Things like hard starts, rough performance, and lost fuel economy are often caused by fuel gum and varnish buildup. Seafoam can help your engine run better and last longer. You simply pour a can into your gas tank. Hunters and anglers rely on Seafoam to keep their engines running the way it should the entire season. So pick up a can of Seafoam today at your local auto parts store or visit seafoamworks.com to learn more.